Today, we'll be speaking about the history of U.S. military intervention abroad, and particularly the Military Intervention Project, a new effort to capture empirically every U.S. military intervention ever. Our guests are Professors Sidita Kushi of Bridgewater State University and Monica Toft of Tufts University. Professors, welcome. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you for having us. I'm really, really delighted. So we're just going to run through some slides. Here's an outline. So the first question is America a bully? We're trying to figure that out. When we started this project, the core question that we were interested in was, how effective has America's reliance on its military posture, its military position, been at securing the nation's interests? Actually, has it been effective? And as the Goliath in the room, I think we can all agree the United States is a very powerful state, and I think you could make the case it remains the most powerful, although it's getting a run for its money, perhaps from China, at least economically. We have to remember the Russian Federation is still a nuclear-armed state, as Putin reminded us nicely this morning. And so the question is as the Goliath in the room, do we really need to care? And so these were sort of guiding us through. And the other thing that we were curious about is that if you look at the United States today, it seems to be sort of at sea. Like, what is our national strategy? In our earlier periods, the book is, designated along different periods. In the early period from 1776 on, it was independence from Britain and establishing itself as a nation state on its own, independent, no longer a colony. And then it was expanding sort of the manifest destiny and conquering the great frontier through the 19th century. 20th century opens, and hesitatingly, the United States entered World War I. It was largely immune from what was happening in Europe, but couldn't stay that way. And then it had to go back again in the 40s to help defeat Italy and Germany, but then also Japan and the Pacific theater. World War II ends. We had 2 nuclear explosions by the United States. And we were concerned about the bipolar Cold War balance with the Soviet Union and its allies up against the United States and its allies. And so preventing World War III sort of drove us from 1945 to 1989 or 91, depending upon when you make the distinction for when the Cold War ended. And then after that, leading a new world order, right? So the United States emerged triumphant. I think we could say the Soviet Union is no longer in existence, it's defunct. And we had the emergence of the Russian Federation and a series of states. And then the United States led a new world order until 9/11, where it sort of refocused us. And we thought, oh my gosh, this global jihad, this extremist fundamentalism, Islam that's coming out of the Middle East and to some extent Asia is a real threat and actually harmed U.S. Property citizens and actually international citizens as well. So trying to prevent another 9/11, creating the global war on terror. And so the question is, we've done that, right? Yes, ISIS is now defeated. It's not completely gone. Al-Qaeda is on the run. Where are we today? And so we coined this term called kinetic diplomacy, with the idea that the United States has sort of gone into hyper mode when it comes to reactions or trying to deal with the international community and overly relying on the use of force. So, an example of this was John Bolton, National Security Chief under Trump. This is a yellow pad on which he scratched. Some journalist, reporter, cameraman caught this. The reaction to what was going on in Venezuela, the crisis there. And the idea was, first of all, we've got to think about Afghanistan and welcoming the Taliban. That was interesting. It didn't happen. But underneath it is 5,000 troops to Colombia, right? That's the way to secure American interests, is to send troops down there, right? Well, that'll deal with it. And so our sense, Sidita and I, thought that the United States has become overly reliant on the use of force, such that other ideas, other issues, diplomacy, economic might, trade, are ephemeral, that even if you think about it, we tend not to follow through on it. And our policies become more reactionary than deliberate as a result, because these are the tools of statecraft that we've become to rely on, and we have a diminished sense of where we can use the other ones. And in a piece that I published a number of years ago, I talked about how the United States has become addicted to intervention. When we feel pain, this is what we do. So I'm going to turn it over to Sidita, because she's going to present some of the data and some of the findings. And, some of them are pretty distressing about what the United States has been doing and what the implications are for the United States. So, Sidita, I'll pass it over to you, and then you can pass it back to me.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and we'll get started. Right. So hopefully everyone can see the data summary slide. So as Monica mentioned, I will be going through a very brief summary of the key data trends within the Military Intervention Project. As John introduced, the Military Intervention Project is an attempt to measure every instance of U.S. military intervention since the founding of the country until the present day. For us, the present day does end in 2019. That's when the last data point for the project wrapped up, but it will eventually become updated as the years progress. According to the Military Intervention Project, we have measured almost 400 U.S. military involvements since the founding of the country. And what's important to note here is that the number alone seems high, but we do believe that in many cases, this might even be an underestimation, given that a lot of covert operations and special operations are very difficult to not only confirm, but to even understand if they are occurring or not occurring. And I can expand upon that in the Q&A if needed. And there are certain involvements, such as the frontier wars, that we do have a separate listing of, but we do not directly include within the traditional military intervention project for reasons that I can also delve into later. Now, according to MIP, the U.S. did intervene over 200 times after the end of World War II up until today. But most interestingly, over 100 of the interventions have occurred in the post-Cold War era, during a time where arguably the U.S. did not have the same existential rivalries and threats as it did during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And about 70 interventions have occurred after 2000, so in the post-9/11 era. And it is no surprise that 77 interventions in MIP have occurred within the Middle East and North Africa, which is a relatively new region of involvement for the United States, as I will show you. Now, this is the general intervention trends by year and region. So the axis here denotes the year in which the intervention began, and then the height of the graph represents the number of interventions per year that began at that time. And then, of course, we color code by region of the world. So the first thing that most will notice is that there seems to be this cyclical up and down trend that's very interesting. So up until the mid 1800s, the United States intervened very, very little, arguably so. And then you see a spike in the mid 1800s, you see a dip again, and then you see another spike in the early 1900s, a dip during the era of US isolationism in the 1930s and the Great Depression. But then ever since the end of World War II, you see a consistent rise in US military interventions for the most part. And the reason you see a dip here, arguably, would be that the data is relatively new and some missions may not be available for public measurement as of yet, or we can discuss possible other reasons for this dip. Another interesting finding here that you'll see is that after the 1990s, and especially in the 2000s, you see a new region of focus for the United States. The lines in pink here, sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to the 2000s and late 90s, we do not see any pink in this graph. But all of a sudden, it makes up a very, very large portion of US military interventions. And of course, this relates to the global war on terror, which we can also discuss later. Now, if we separate US interventions by the eras of US objectives that Monica has introduced for us, you see some interesting trends as well. You see that in the early days of the country, most interventions happened within Latin America and the Caribbean. And this trend continued up until the early 1900s. This is understandable because of the Monroe Doctrine and the US's Western hegemonic status later on during that era. Now, between the end of World War I and the end of World War II, the US decreased its interventionism. This was the interwar era, known for US isolationism relative to other eras across history. And then you see a very, very great increase during, of course, the Cold War era, where the geographic trends change as well. Instead of the US intervening in the Western Hemisphere for the most part, within its own sphere of influence geographically, it begins to intervene almost equally across most parts of the world. And then we see that in the 1990s, the US begins now to intervene in sub-Saharan Africa much more regularly, and as well as still in Europe and Central Asia. And then by the more contemporary era, you see most of the interventions occurring within the Middle East and North Africa, as well as sub-Saharan Africa. And one thing to point out here is that while most US interventions have occurred during the Cold War era, we have to keep in mind that this era includes more years than this following eras. So the rate of interventionism is actually growing during this time, even though the frequency of interventions still does favor the Cold War. But the Cold War is many, many years on top of the years included in these intervals. So it's important to keep that in mind. So what were the main objectives that the US has listed for its interventions? In our military intervention project, we do code a number of possible operation or mission objectives, and we base this coding on the official mandate. So in the data, we do not take it up to ourselves to decide whether the US was genuine or not so genuine in the listed objectives of the mission. We just code what the mandate states, and these mission objectives do not have to be mutually exclusive. So a mission can be for the pursuit of regime building while at the same time be economically oriented or economically beneficial. So missions can have more than one main objective. Now, as you can see, the economic objective was much more prominent in the early era of the country, the 1700s and the 1800s. You see the economic objective really dominated for the most part. And then another interesting point here is that the biggest, most frequent objective for US interventionism has been the protection of its own people, civilians, its own diplomats, and its own property. And this generally has remained consistent across eras, with the exception of the more recent era, the post 9/11 era. Something else to keep in mind is that when you look at the Cold War era, you see that regime building is a very, very big component of US military objectives. And then when you look at the 1990s prior to 9/11, you will see that there is social protection that becomes important, more so than other eras. It starts to rise during that time. All right. So we know a little bit about what motivates or what are the official objectives of these interventions. So let's learn a little bit more about the hostility level. That's what we call it. Whether the US displays force, whether the US goes to war, or whether the US threatens or uses force. So we have hostility level measurements as part of MIP. The lowest is the threat of force, and the highest is interstate war. So, according to MIP, the total of US history has consisted of 40% usage of force and about 52% displays of force, with very few threats of force. And the hostility levels have unfortunately increased alongside frequency in more recent decades. So that's what this graph shows, and another graph that will follow. So if you notice, during the Cold War era, many, many more years, you see that there are much more displays of force relative to usages of force. And then in the 1990s, that still holds. Much more displays of force, fewer usage of force. And then in the more modern era, we see that there is becoming not 100% equalized, but there is a trend towards more proportionality between the usage of force, and the display of force. You see that inching into the displays of force. And this graph does a pretty good job of showcasing this trend as well. And this graph shows US responses during a dispute relative to the responses of the target states or the rival states within the dispute. So the orange line measures the highest military action the US has used within that dispute across the eras that we classify in comparison to the other states' actions during that dispute across the same timeline. So in the beginning, you see that while the US was generally more escalatory than other state actors, mainly because they were responding or engaging with states that were generally weaker within the Western Hemisphere during that time, you see that during the Cold War, there was an almost even escalation and de-escalation because of arguably the bipolar world order. But after the end of the Cold War, while the US's dispute rivals decrease in their hostility or de-escalate, the US actually escalates. So this gap here is extremely interesting as a finding for MIP. All right, another interesting finding is that while the US has increased its intervention rate across more recent eras, it has done so in pursuit of lower levels of national interest. So we measure national interests with an additive index that we create. It measures contiguity, alliances, oil wealth or resource wealth related to the target state. And we find that starting in the 1990s, the US has intervened in pursuit of lower levels of national interest than it did in prior eras, which we also think is quite an interesting policy finding. All right, on that note, I will hand it back to Monica to tell us why we should care about these trends.
Thank you, Sidita. So that's just, I have to say, that's just some of our data. We have an article that came out in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and then we have a full book treatment of this. And even in the book, we have appendices with tons of charts. So we're just giving you a teaser of some of the data. And so, a big question, John, is why should we care? And so we highlight just 5. I think people can come up with more. But the first one is that we're using force at a time when we found, and we're not alone in this, actually, I'm going to show you other people's data, when the use of force is most limited. So this is just to give you, these are pictures that are, almost 50 years apart. The one on the left is South Vietnam and the evacuation of the embassy, and the right is the evacuation of the embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, a year ago. And what the data are clear from us and from others is that securing our interests has become even more difficult through the use of force. And we face, as a great power, as a major power, nuclear armed power, a riskier threat environment. And force may not be the best way to do it. So this is data from Toft, How the Weak Win Wars. And this book came out, in 2000. And basically what he showed was that great powers over time are losing more and more of their fights. So whereas in the 1800s to 1849, back in this period, they were winning 9 out of 10 times, 80%, 88% of the time. And by the way, these are powers that are 10 times weaker than the United States. We're talking really asymmetric fights, right? And then the 1850s to the 1900, they were winning 8 out of 10. By 1900 to 1949, only 6 to 7 of the conflicts. And by the 1950s, strong actors were winning only about 50% of the time. It's basically a crapshoot. So you think about the United States in Vietnam, you think about the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, you think about the United States in Afghanistan, you think about Russia today in Ukraine, right? Had they seen these data, the leaders of those countries seen these data, they might have thought twice about sort of trying to go up and whoop upside the head a weaker state, because it's turning out it's not as effective. Now, he's got a whole series of arguments for why that's the case, but one of which is just basic strategy and the innovation of guerrilla strategies, particularly after Mao Zedong sort of innovated them, but then also nationalism. It's much harder today, after the 1850s in particular, to take and hold territory because citizens fight really hard, and I think that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. So second reason is it's actually not domestically in line with what Americans want. So if you look at a whole series of polls, most Americans do not think that the United States is actually achieving what it needs to be achieving in order to be satisfied with the stature of the country. You can see there was an uptick in the 2000s as a result of sort of the fight against the Taliban, not the Taliban, against Al-Qaeda, which was being hosted by the Taliban. But then that dips off very dramatically. And you could see that Americans became quite disheartened by it, in part because of the war in Iraq, also that Afghanistan wasn't going well. And so now most Americans, over a majority of Americans, are dissatisfied with what's going on in terms of U.S. foreign policy. Moreover, data also show that the United States citizens think that the United States should stay engaged, but it doesn't necessarily have to take the leading role. It doesn't always have to be the one that's forefront and out in front. A major role is good enough, and that's pretty consistent through time. And in fact, if you look at the data again, more people now think a major role more so than even in 2001. And that's important, right? These are citizens. And I think that they should be listened to. It's their tax dollars that are going into these defense budgets in order to do these fights. So not saying to become isolated, but that maybe thinking about a major role rather than a leading role. So that's the second reason. So one is it doesn't seem to be effective, and it's become more effective over time. Two is not what Americans want. And the third is reputation. The United States is now seen as a threat around the world. And I have to say, as an American citizen who carries a passport, I'm off to the UK next week. That makes me nervous. I don't want people to think I'm a bully. I don't want them to think my country is a bully. And yet, around the world, the United States is now seen as a major threat, right? Our power and influence, these sharp elbows that we have, knocking around at other people in other countries are now seeing this as a major threat. And what's even more distressing, and I'd like to see these data after what's happened with Russia and Ukraine in February, is that the United States had been outpacing globally Russia and China as a bigger threat to democracy. We're supposed to be the home to democracy, right? And we're seen as a bigger threat to democracy than China and Russia was. And only in the US, look at this, only in the US, and it's because they didn't ask probably about how can Americans see the U.S. as threatening, although I'm sure some American citizens would have answered affirmatively to that. But in any event, you can see that the United States is up there. Now, I'm sure in some places this has changed a bit. Europe, perhaps, Russia is probably out here in front. I would be shocked if it weren't. But in any event, this should make Americans uneasy. So that's, the third reason. A fourth reason is that our adversaries, and to some extent our allies, might use our militarized behavior to justify their own actions and behavior. And indeed, we're seeing this. In fact, Putin, this is right before he went into Ukraine in February, was asked by Prime Minister Scholz, will there be war in Europe? Can you rule out that possibility? And what did he say? There's already been war in Europe, right? And where did he turn to? Kosovo in particular. In 1999, Putin warned, if you go into Kosovo, you're going to pay for that. That is sort of an action that we don't think is justified or legitimate. And so he indeed raised that issue again 22 years later, saying the war against Yugoslavia, and he was talking about the engagement in Kosovo, and making the case that we've already seen war in Europe. Of course, not mentioning his own interventions in Crimea and the Donbass and the Luhansk. But the point is that we lose legitimacy, and we have lost legitimacy because of our overzealousness and the use of force. And then President Xi, he's a little bit more guarded. I mean, we know this about this man. But, he talks about unilateralism, protectionism, and egoism, and he's talking about the United States, that we don't want to sort of have that kind of behavior, and that he's sort of, giving us sort of a warning that it's not going to lead to anything but a dead end. So our biggest adversaries today, China and Russia, use our own behavior sort of against us. So that's the fourth reason. And the last reason is that we may be spending more, not only for less, but for worse. And so this is data coming out of the Cost of War Project at Brown University. And they're looking at the global war on terror, particularly looking at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and have calculated how much those two wars and those two invasions have cost. And what they did was really interesting. This is per millions of US dollars spent, how many jobs you will actually create in the US economy. And you can see that education, Sidita and I are happy with these data, right? So if you spend $1 million, you're going to get more jobs in education than you are in the federal defense sector, which actually comes out to the lowest. You get more, clean energy, solar, wind, but particularly in education. And I think we all agree that our educational system needs help, as do our healthcare system. So again, these are guns and butter trade-offs. The DoD budget every year goes up, and the State Department, this year I think under the Biden administration did increase it a bit, but it's never risen above 5.5% of the Department of Defense budget. Think about that. The State Department budget is 5.5% at its peak relative to that of the defense budget. So national security, and foreign policy, it's sort of, we've had an inversion of some of our hard-won lessons of the past. We should have learned from Vietnam. We didn't. We forgot the lessons there. And we got sort of arrogant when we went into Iraq and then into Afghanistan. And we think even more, that some of this is reflected in domestic policy too, that the idea that you have one hammer, that maybe also we're starting to see this, or we have seen this, both domestically in terms of prisons and criminality, right? We're not sure about this, but it's speculation. Sociologists might want to think about this. But we do know from the data that in foreign and domestic that there are long-term costs associated with what we're doing in terms of building infrastructure and having alternatives. And I teach at the Fletcher School. Sidita teaches international security. And when we talk about sort of tools of statecraft, we talk about it as DIME, and I'm sure some of the audience knows about that. But the idea is diplomacy, intelligence, or information sharing, military tools, and then economic tools of statecraft. And what we want to do is actually put them in their proper order and go back to diplomacy more. And I would say, even when it comes to economic tools of statecraft, what's our favorite? Sanctions. And sanctions are punitive, right? So even there, we have some warning signs that you want to think about a little bit more on the carrot side, a little bit more on the talking side, and not sort of resorting to the use of force. So that's all we have, John. I think we can open it up to questions at this point. I'll stop sharing, and hopefully we've fed enough information out there so we can have a really good response.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think, just maybe to work through like how you guys are coding some of these cases, because maybe some concrete examples would be helpful. Just off the top of my head, the U.S. shooting some cruise missiles at the Houthis in Yemen on kind of a one-off thing in 2016. What would that be? And then maybe, in the 60s, one of our first military engagements with Saudi Arabia was we sent a bunch of F-100s there during the Yemeni civil war, kind of to reassure them against the Yemeni rebels. I'm curious how those two cases might be coded, or if they would count in the database.
I'll let Sidita handle that. I spoke way too much.
Yes. So the first case, the example that you list, that would be coded as a usage of force. For sure, it would be part of the military intervention project. The second example that you provide, the giving of military equipment, advisorship, and sale of weapons, that would not count as a military intervention. While extremely important, and it does talk about any sort of escalation and possible future action, advisorship and security protocols and promises and equipment does not count as a military intervention in MIP.
Sure. So what about like a deployment? What about sending, because we sent the F-100s to Saudi Arabia as like it was a U.S. Air Force unit that was there for a period, flying around just kind of as it was a display of force, but it was all within Saudi Arabia, fully with Saudi Arabia's consent.
Yes, so that is the big distinction there. It has to be an official U.S. threat display of force against the target state. So the display of force in this case was not truly a display of force against Saudi Arabia. It was supportive. It was a supportive deployment, supportive weapons.
What about, say, Trump's fire and fury remark about North Korea? Does that count?
So we do not know. It is not included within the military intervention project. We were talking about it back when we were working on the data set, and we were thinking, do Twitter threats count? That's a very, very new phenomenon that we have to work through and deal with. But at this point in time, that is not included in the data set. And I'm not sure whether it would count. It's not an official threat by the U.S. government. It is social media for the most part by a specific US president at the time.
Sure. So we've got a question in the Q&A from Pascal, who asks, does your database include the US wars against Native American tribes in the 18th and 19th century? Do you count them as states? And maybe to expand on that, that view of our history, whether or not you count those as interventions, there's certainly a perception that changes how American history looks, because you could, on the one hand, if you count them, you could make a case that, like, wow, the United States has been really interventionist across its history. Conversely, if you don't, you could say, hey, there's this kind of golden era in the past that we can return to, which, as the head of the John Quincy Adams Society, I might be indicating where I come down in that debate, but I'm curious where you guys did.
Yeah, so I could start and then Sidita, you go in. That was actually one of the reasons why we started the data set, John, was precisely because other data sets didn't include them. These were nations with treaties with the United States, and we violated them. And we went in and we sort of annihilated, peoples and sovereign nations. And that bothered us. But the problem is methodologically. So intellectually, theoretically, we thought that they should have been included. The problem is when we started integrating them, because you're right, they end up the first issue is how do you code them? Do you code them by tribe, right? So there's hundreds of tribes. And what about engagement? So every time a Cherokee Nation was attacked and then was counterattacked, or was it engagements, a longer-term, month-long, year-long engagement? So what we did was we included it all, right? So that other scholars can come along and figure out what questions do they want to answer. So they can do it looking at just tribal engagements. They can look at just with individual tribes. They can look at engagements over time with different tribes, or they can look at individual attacks. And the problem with individual attacks, of course, is it's going to really drive up the numbers. So I think what we've done is sort of a service, was allow for scholars to slice and dice the data in ways that they would find useful for them. And then what we're doing now is writing an article sort of exploring those data on their own terms and making the case that the United States was not as isolationist, was not as specific as I think some historians, some conventional wisdoms would have us believe. And I think in part because those cases haven't been included. And I'll turn it over to Sidita.
And let me add to that exactly what Monica said, that it is a methodological problem. Theoretically, both of us and most of the team that we worked with agree that the frontier wars, they are an example of U.S. military interventionism against a sovereign state, nation, and they should be included in any data set of U.S. military intervention. But to give you an idea of the scope of the methodological problem, we do take data that was given to us very generously by Jeffrey Friedman on the number of U.S. conflicts with specific tribes and across the years, across states, and across geographic lines. This data set includes casualties and all sorts of very interesting, yet also equally terrifying numbers. So we use this data, we try to integrate it to the best of our abilities within our MIP, more traditional U.S. military interventions, as far as the IR community is concerned, at least. And we find out that if we did integrate this data, it would be about 400 U.S. traditional military interventions and about 2,000 instances of conflict between the U.S. and a specific tribe within a specific year in a specific territory. And even if we broke it down into just the U.S. versus a specific tribe or nation, in this case, it would still be over 100 conflicts, just trying to aggregate it within state, within year, and within a specific nation. So we methodologically couldn't find a way to do this without completely eclipsing the more traditional U.S. military interventions that we collected as part of MIP. But the Frontier Wars data exists. It is just a methodological challenge to integrate it together with more contemporary interventions.
Yeah, I'm curious if there's a pattern in that set of data, if there's if there are cycles, periods of greater intervention, lesser intervention, greater hostility, et cetera?
There sure is. That we do explore that in more detail. We have a book actually coming out in January that expands greatly on the military intervention project and on the article itself. And we dedicate a part of the second chapter and we show graphical illustrations of the trends. The most important trends, of course, are exactly how most people talk about the frontier wars as Western expansion, the Western wars, et cetera. But we find that initially a lot of the frontier wars actually occurred in the East and then much more so in the Midwest. And that is not just a small blip, that is a very, very big increase in US military interventionism, even before we move towards Western expansion and the Western part of the continent. So I remember graphing that data out and being very surprised that the East actually had a large number of these conflicts way earlier than I anticipated, and that the conflicts didn't really end significantly as part of the data set trends until, the early 1900s. There was still a significant increase in interventionism because of the frontier wars. So this is about 200 years almost of US interventionism because of intercontinental fighting. That few people addresses that.
Yeah, I mean, it even predates the founding of the United States. George Washington fought in the, what we call the French and Indian War, which was our part of the war and of the Austrian succession, I think. But involved a lot of tribes up in the northwest area of the colonies being supported by various outside parties. We've got a question from Will, I think from our Florida chapter. Could you give some more insight into whether you see this trend of increased U.S. intervention continuing or increasing into the 2020s, or is it too early to tell? And I think maybe related to that, you mentioned this possibility that there could be some undercounts on some of the current post 9/11 wars.
Yeah, I could take that. So, Will, it's a great question. Sidita and I think you can see this. We're kind of data junkies, and we're letting the data speak to us. And so at this point, I think it's too early to tell. And then the other thing is, I think, although our data set reveals that it doesn't matter the kind of administration, actually across time it's kind of consistent. It doesn't matter if it's Democratic or Republic or different presidents. On the other hand, we don't want to count out two things. One is learning. Maybe the United States is learning. The Biden administration did pull out of Afghanistan last year. It has been very reluctant to engage in the war in Ukraine, despite the fact we're sending billions of dollars of equipment into that country. And so there may be learning going on, and our understanding is some of these data have made it to the administration. So we're maybe hopefully having some impact for people to see this, that there are alternatives to the use of force. That's one issue. And then the second issue is that you do have other states now pushing back. So China is flexing its muscles under President Xi. And this morning, very scarily, Vladimir Putin is saying, look, if you push us hard enough and you come, he wants to do these referenda in order to say that it's Russian territory, to then say, I have to defend Russian territory. But there is more pushback than there was in the 1990s and early 2000s. And that will perhaps make the United States or the administration pause. So you can't say yet, but theoretically, empirically, there's evidence to say that perhaps we should see a decline. But what's so fun but scary about being an academic is that we can track this. And as Sidita said, our data stop in 2019, but we are trying to push forward to keep going, to keep the counting up. Because it's really important to understand where we go in the future. Because it could go up or it could stay stagnant. And I have to say, I'm uncomfortable with either of those. I'd like to see them go down.
And I agree with Monica that I think it's too soon to tell. We can definitely make theoretical arguments. We can definitely talk about whether we are still in an era of unipolarity, and if not, perhaps that would have a very big impact on U.S. interventionism if we argue that unipolarity has spurred further U.S. interventionism. And the debate, of course, rages on that, and we hope to make a dent in that debate pretty soon with our data and new articles that will be coming out. To take the second question that you asked, John, why we think that some of the post 9/11 data is underreported. And again, this is something that we think we cannot yet confirm. But when we do look through the data sources, through the archives, through the documents, for the most part, we only list an intervention within MIP if we can confirm that intervention through at least 3 reliable sources. So reliable news sources, reliable archival sources, and textbooks on U.S. military, naval, etc. history. So there are instances where certain special operations in the post 9/11 era do not have enough publicly available information to confirm them as a U.S. intervention by our MIP standards. As you might already know, as part of MIP, not only do we include the data set of interventions, but every single data point includes a 3-page narrative outlining what happened, the fatalities, what the outcomes were, and several, at least 3 sources on where we obtained our information, so everyone can do their own checks and can delve deeper into that intervention if they want. So each data source, each data point has a narrative to go alongside it. And if we can't confirm something through at least 3 data sources, we don't include it. We do have a list of uncertain interventions. So we have about 100 or so uncertain interventions where we cannot confirm. So we do not include it as part of the official numbers, but they are listed in the data set under a category called remove case. So if you don't mind the uncertainty, you can throw those in. If you want the ones that we can confirm, you make sure to keep those out. Another thing that we found is that, of course, many covert operations by their very nature are difficult to confirm. So we are aware that we don't know what we don't know, which is a big problem whenever you're trying to measure any covert or special operations. And lastly, in the post 9/11 era, we do find that a lot of government sources that we relied upon tend to aggregate multiple regional operations together as one. Within one or a few mandates. So we had to kind of go through, a line that is a paragraph long that lists this month, the US sent additional troops to this country, this country, this country, this country, 20 countries. And then we have to individually look into exactly what happened. So that type of aggregation in our sources makes it likely that we may have missed some interventions.
And another finding that was very interesting was about the relationship between intervention and democracy in the target state. Because traditionally people say, oh yeah, there's a democratic piece, like 2 democracies don't go to war with each other, which presumably would include the United States. But you found something different. Tell us about that.
We actually find in a very, very quick test on this democratization idea or, democratic peace thesis. So we're trying to test some of the main tenets of liberalism. We find that on average, the US tends to intervene in countries that have slightly higher scores of democratization, according to the Polity Index. And now something that we don't find directly through MIP, but a lot of the literature tends to confirm, is that when the US does indeed intervene in different parts of the world, these target states do not appear to turn into democracies. They tend to usually turn into illiberal regimes and civilian dictatorships for the most part. So both in terms of the targets and the outcome, the literature alongside MIP does not very well confirm this democratization thesis. But again, I want to be very cautious here because it is too soon to tell. And what you see in that article is just the beginning of trying to tell our audience of how you can use MIP to start testing out these theories. So we don't have all the answers yet. We're not saying that realism or liberalism, one wins over the other. It was mainly a test of here's one thing you can do. And of course, you can do more things depending on the questions you'd like to ask.
Yeah, well, that I think brings up another a natural question here. That you talked about, polarity and its relationship with this data set, and you talked about democracy and its relationship to this data set. I'm curious if there are any questions that you're eager to see other scholars take up in their use of this set, because I know you said you had something like 200 variables across each case, so there's a lot that you could do with it, and that's even just within the data itself. You could also correlate it with other stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, so John, I'll answer that. For some reason my internet is a little wonky right now, so I'm just going to turn it off so that you don't lose me. So I just want to follow up on the thing about the democratization, because it's a really important piece. The United States sees itself as a city upon the hill and wants to promote democracy around the world. And one of the interesting things we as scholars have accepted is that the states that are most prone to violence are those that are democratizing, right? So they have some semblance or a little bit of democracy in play. And then the United States, we know this, does step in and try to give them a punch. And I think that we're picking up on that in our data. So one of the things is are we picking up on that? So that would be a great hypothesis for somebody to test, to see whether indeed it's the case that we are picking up on that democratization, that sort of U relationship, that is those in-betweens. It's not those pure democracies or pure autocracies, but it's those in-between states that are more prone to instability and the possibility of U.S. intervention, because the United States feels as if it can tilt. But one of the things that we found early on is that when the United States intervenes, it doesn't improve the democracy on the other end. So that's kind of unnerving, because if we are trying to do democracy promotion and we're finding that we're actually harming the prospects of that because of intervention, that's not a good thing. So again, that's another hypothesis that we explored very tangentially and very early on, Sidita. I don't think we did much with it. But I think that that's another big one, because I do like to think of the United States as a city upon the hill, but if we're doing more harm, sort of the Hippocratic oath, if we're actually doing more harm with these interventions, we should be aware. The other issue is that I think, and where Sidita and I would love to go, is first the Native American frontier wars. We are working on a paper on that. The other one is trying to help adjudicate the whole, you're right, John, the whole thing about structures, unipolar versus multipolar versus bipolar worlds. And we think we do have a paper on unipolarity where we talk about that. But one issue there is that you're going to have to be very theoretical and logical and not necessarily statistical, because we don't have a lot of cases of unipolar worlds, right? And we don't have a lot of cases of multipolar worlds. And then we have the bipolar world, which was dominated by nuclear weapons. So what was driving that? Was it because we were perfectly balanced poles, or perfectly balanced poles that had this umbrella, this nuclear umbrella? But I think that you can speculate and go into our cases a little bit more about the kinds of engagements that the US and the Soviets were involved in, and now today the United States. And I saw in the question somebody was asking about whether we include engagements with allies, and indeed we do. So we look at whether engagement was the United States on its own, whether the United States engaged bilaterally, and whether it engaged in a formal alliance structure, whether it had a UN Security Council resolution sort of okaying the intervention. So that is all included in the data set. So what's exciting about it is, as I said earlier, is that scholars can come with their own hypotheses, their own theoretical speculations, and really use these data to pull out different kinds of hypotheses and surprise us. Like I said, for us, there were a lot of surprises. We should have anticipated the regional, but we didn't expect it to be that dramatic. But to us, what that showed is the U.S. moved from being a continental power to a regional power to a global power. Does it mean that we eventually could go back to being a regional power or even a continental power? I mean, I think, look at Russia today. Russia's being pushed back from being a global power to a regional power, and actually it might be pushed back into being just power. And you can see that sort of play in those kinds of dynamics. I mean, we like big history, and this data set allows us to do sort of big historical analysis.
We've got a question from Stuart in the audience. Has the elimination of military conscription in 1973 played a role in some of this expansion of uses of force and what you called kinetic diplomacy? Do you see that as a relationship? I know that there have been folks who have done research on conscription and war.
Our data set can't address with that directly. I mean, we don't have that question and we can speculate about it. I mean, I think one of the things that we're clear about, we're not alone in this, is sadly, I think everybody on this call cares about foreign policy and national security policy, but most Americans don't. And so I think the strongest argument out there for conscription is that at least everybody touches it or is aware that there's soldiers going and fighting and dying in far off places, and without conscription, that's not touching as many lives. But our data set, unfortunately, isn't touching upon that directly. Now, what you could do is potentially look at size of the U.S. Army and U.S. forces over time and see, as the proportion of the American population that served has gone down, whether that's had an impact on sort of, so that the common sense hypothesis would be that the fewer American lives that are touched directly. So if you had a mother or father who served, you served, a cousin, you could triangulate and then see if that goes down, the number of deployments goes up, right? Because the leadership is more to do this because the citizens.
Sure, we might have lost you there, but yeah, go ahead.
Add one more thing. So while we can't directly answer the conscription question with the military intervention project, it's a very interesting question. And coincidentally, according to MIP, the last year on record without a new U.S. military intervention was 1974. So that's just a little tidbit that seems to coincide, but again, does not mean causality or correlation.
Yeah, I'm not super deep on the literature around conscription. There's definitely competing narratives about, whether you give people a stake in the conflict and thereby potentially reduce it, or that you might have the opposite effect, that giving the state a big pool of labor that it can use can lengthen the wars. Another question that we had was about some of these some of the civil wars. You both have studied civil wars in some of your other scholarship, and I'm curious, how you see the relationship between U.S. interventions and other countries being in a state of civil war. Are those more attractive cases, less attractive cases for U.S. intervention generally? Is there a change over time, anything like that?
So I can start this, and then I'm sure Monica will be able to add much more to it. So I study specifically humanitarian military interventions. So when states intervene as third-party actors within a humanitarian crisis, oftentimes that does tend to be a civil war, but it can be other types of international crises. According to the Military Intervention Project, what we have seen so far is that it was in the post-Cold War era where we've seen the U.S. wield its military power much more towards missions of democratization, human rights enforcement, humanitarian interventions, and third-party interventions within these domestic crises or civil wars across the world. So that has been a generally new phenomenon. And again, I label them humanitarian because that is the mandate and the objective that the United States has often used when intervening. In some cases, in the 1990s, as in my perspective, the NATO Kosovo intervention, the U.S. has succeeded in the protection of human rights within that target region of the world, and many would call it a civil war. But in other cases, such as in Libya and Syria, arguably the U.S.'s involvement within that civil war has been much messier, and the results much less clear and often much less positive.
So just to close out, a question that we like to ask all of our guests: what's one piece of advice that you would give to someone who wants to follow in your footsteps?
You know what I would say? ask big questions, get a lot of really smart people around you, and start answering them. I mean, I think we're facing a lot of crises around the world, and I've always tried to ask really big questions. I know I can't answer them myself, but stay curious, read a lot, and then just ask for help when you're trying to answer these questions. And that's what I did with this project. I mean, it took 5 years, millions of dollars. There's a lot of money behind this because it's such an important project and really smart people. Sidita's brilliant. And we had about 40 research assistants from the Fletcher School, Tufts University. It was a project that could not be done alone. I had to ask for help in many, many ways and pull together a team in order to do this.
And my suggestions would be find a question or set of questions that really motivate you, that really you're passionate about, and you have personal reason, personal investment that matters a lot to you. In my case, that was the studying of humanitarian interventions, which led me to the study of U.S. military interventions overall. The second is find good mentors. Find people who will help support you, who will kind of show you the ropes and show you the way, and who will not only work together as collaborators and researchers, but will be strong mentors to you, as Monica in this case has been for me. And last but not least, this is not the most popular thing to say, but invest in statistical methods, in foreign policy analysis and political science and social sciences, if that is your interest. Start early and start investing in statistical methods and statistical knowledge. I think that has helped me more than a lot of other things have.
John, just to follow up, there's no disputing the data. I mean, that's what makes this project so powerful, is that if somebody comes very powerful.
Yeah, we might have lost you again there, but that is all the time we have. Thank you, Dr. Kushi, Dr. Toft, and to all of our guests for attending. This has been another digital discussion with the John Quincy Adams Society. Good night.